Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are talking about something that has the power to completely change the financial trajectory of a family: generational wealth. You may have heard this term thrown around a lot lately, especially in conversations about money, inequality, and building a better future. But what does it actually mean? How does it work? And more importantly, how do you build it? That is exactly what we are breaking down today. So let's get into it. Generational wealth, sometimes called family wealth, legacy wealth, or multi-generational wealth, refers to any type of asset that one generation passes down to the next. Now, when most people hear that, they immediately think of cash, stocks, bonds, real estate, or a family business. And yes, all of those count. But generational wealth can actually be much broader than just money and possessions. It can also include traditions, heirlooms, an educational legacy, and even connections, the kind of network and social capital that opens doors for the next generation. So while the financial side of it often gets the most attention, the concept is really about anything of lasting value that moves from one generation to the next. Typically, this transfer of assets happens after a family member passes away. Most people are familiar with the idea of leaving something behind in a will, but it does not always work that way. There are plenty of situations where wealth is passed down while both the giver and the recipient are still alive. Maybe a parent helps a child with a down payment on a house, or grandparents pay for a grandchild's college education. When a substantial gift of money or assets moves from one living person to another, it is formally known as an inter vivos transfer. Either way, the goal is the same: creating a financial foundation that the next generation can build on. So why does generational wealth matter so much? Think of it this way: families that successfully build and transfer wealth to the next generation have a significant head start over those that do not. Their children and grandchildren may not have to struggle with financial insecurity, housing costs, or food insecurity in the same way, because they were given a foundation rather than having to build one entirely from scratch. That does not mean life is without challenges, but it does mean the starting line is in a very different place. And over multiple generations, those advantages compound in powerful ways. Now, here is where it gets important to talk about the numbers. Half of all inheritances in the United States are valued at less than $50,000. Only about 2% are worth $1 million or more. So for most families, we are not talking about enormous fortunes. Even a modest inheritance can make a meaningful difference. But the distribution of who actually receives generational wealth is deeply unequal. A Federal Reserve study found that 30% of white families received an inheritance, compared to just 10% of Black families, 7% of Hispanic families, and 18% of families of other races. And white families also tend to anticipate receiving larger inheritances on average. Those gaps are significant, and they do not exist by accident. One of the biggest drivers of the generational wealth gap is home ownership. For most families, a home is the single most valuable asset they will ever own. It appreciates over time, it can be passed down, and it can even be used to generate rental income. But home ownership rates in the U.S. are far from equal. In the fourth quarter of 2021, the Black home ownership rate was 43%, compared to 74% for white Americans. That gap is not simply a matter of personal financial choices. Historical policies like redlining, housing discrimination, and gentrification actively blocked communities of color from accessing the housing market for decades. In cities like Seattle, for example, traditional lenders historically used criteria that prevented non-white buyers from getting the loans they needed to purchase a home. When you combine that with limited access to small business loans, quality education, and equitable health care, you get a cycle that is very difficult to break. And that cycle is a big part of why the generational wealth gap persists today. Education is another major piece of this puzzle. There is a strong, well-documented connection between higher education and greater earning potential over a lifetime. Someone who enters adulthood without student debt, because their family was able to pay for college, starts their financial life with a massive advantage. They can begin saving, investing, and building wealth much sooner than someone who spends years paying off loans. That single difference can shape the entire arc of a person's financial life, and it is one of the more subtle but powerful ways that generational wealth moves from one generation to the next. So, how do you actually start building generational wealth, especially if you are starting from scratch? It begins with getting your own financial foundation in order. That means building an emergency fund so you are not derailed by unexpected expenses, paying down high-interest debt like credit cards that erode your financial progress, and consistently saving for both short-term goals like a home down payment and long-term security through retirement accounts like a 401k or an IRA. Investing in stocks, bonds, and other vehicles that grow through compound interest is also critical. The earlier you start, the more time your money has to work for you. Starting a business is another powerful path because a successful family business can provide income, employment, and an asset that can be passed down for generations. And of course, buying a home rather than renting gives you a tangible asset that builds equity over time and can be handed down to your children. Once you have started building that wealth, the next step is thinking carefully about how to pass it on. There are several tools available for this. A last will and testament lets you specify exactly where your assets go after you pass. A trust gives you even more control over how and when assets are distributed. Life insurance ensures that your family is financially protected even if something happens to you unexpectedly. Designating beneficiaries on retirement accounts and investment accounts is a simple but often overlooked step. And of course, directly paying for a child or grandchild's education is one of the most impactful gifts you can give, one that pays dividends for decades. Here is the takeaway. Generational wealth is not just for the ultra-rich. It is a concept that applies to anyone who wants to leave their family in a better position than they found themselves in. Even modest steps, buying a home, investing consistently, eliminating debt, and planning your estate can create a meaningful legacy over time. The wealth gap is real, and systemic barriers have made this harder for some families than others. But understanding how generational wealth works is the first step toward building it. And every generation has to start somewhere. Why not this one? Thanks for watching. If this video was helpful, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss what we have coming next. Drop a comment below. Are you actively working to build generational wealth for your family? I would love to hear where you are on that journey. See you in the next one.